Shin Geometry had just stepped out of the black crane when something stopped him cold. Not a rival. Not a blade pressed against his throat in the dark. Not even the kind of threat his 6 bodyguards were paid to neutralize before he ever noticed it. A little girl. 7 years old, maybe. Dark braids framing a tear-streaked face, standing in the middle of the rain-slicked pavement in a pale pink dress that had no business being out in weather like this. And in her outstretched hands, trembling, insistent, refusing to lower, was a patchwork rag doll. Mismatched button eyes. Crooked stitching across a body made from whatever fabric her mother could find. The kind of doll that wasn't bought. The kind that was made, stitch by careful stitch, by someone who didn't have money but had love to spare. She wasn't offering it as a gift. She was paying him with it. His men moved instantly, 4 suits closing the distance in under 2 seconds, hands already reaching. But Shin raised one finger. Just one. And they stopped as if the air itself had hardened around them. He looked at the girl for a long moment. Then Shin Geometry, the men whose name alone had emptied boardrooms and silenced courtrooms, the men the Seoul Underworld called the blade that doesn't rust, slowly folded his tall frame downward until his eyes were level with hers. His charcoal suit jacket pressed against the wet concrete. He didn't care. "What's her name?" he asked quietly, nodding at the doll. The girl's chin trembled. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Luna. She has one eye because mommy used the other button to fix my coat." She pushed the doll closer, right into the space between them. "But mommy needs her more than I do right now. Please, Mr. Monster. Please take her. She's all I have." He took it. The worn fabric settled into his scarred palm, soft, weightless, and somehow heavier than anything he had ever held. A child's entire sense of safety, reduced to something that fit inside one hand. He held it the way you hold a thing you have no right to touch. Then his voice dropped to that low, measured register that made seasoned criminals forget how to breathe. "Who took her, little one?" She didn't flinch. Those dark, tear-filled eyes held his with a steadiness that had no business existing in a 7-year-old, and something about the sheer, quiet courage of it made a muscle in Shin's jaw go tight. And then she said 9 words. 9 words that made every single one of his 30 armed men reach for their guns at exactly the same time. "Stay with me," because what this child whispered next didn't just shatter something inside the most feared men in the city. It exposed a betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it would force Shin Geometry to burn his own empire from the inside out to keep a promise made to a rag doll. If this story already has your heart, hit that like button, subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales, and drop a dragon in the comments if you stay all the way to the end. Now, let's begin. The city of Seoul did not sleep. But it did, in certain hours, go very still, the way a room goes still when someone dangerous walks into it. Shin Geometry understood that stillness. He had built it, brick by brick, over 15 years. His day began at 4:47 every morning. Not 4:45. Not 5 o'clock. Precision was not a habit for Shin, it was a philosophy. He believed that a man who could not control his own minutes had no business controlling anything else. He was dressed and seated at his private desk by 5 o'clock, a single glass of barley tea cooling beside a leather-bound ledger that his accountants were never permitted to touch. He reviewed the numbers himself. Every column. Every discrepancy. Every figure that didn't sit flush with the ones beside it. Because in his world, the lie always lived in the small numbers. By 7 o'clock, his corps lieutenants had delivered their morning reports, brief, structured, delivered standing. No chairs were offered in Shin's private office. Chairs encouraged comfort, and comfort made men slow. His office reflected this. No artwork on the walls. No photographs on the desk. One window, facing east, because Shin believed a man should always know exactly where the light was coming from. The organization he ran stretched across 6 districts and touched everything from import logistics to private security contracts to the kind of real estate transactions that never appeared in any public registry. On paper, Shin Geometry was the chairman of a mid-sized holding company with unremarkable earnings. In practice, he was the load-bearing wall of an entire criminal architecture. Remove him, and everything above came down. His men did not fear him the way soldiers fear a general. They feared him the way a building fears its own foundation. Not with noise. With weight. There were stories, of course. There were always stories. That he had once sat across from a rival boss at a dinner table, said nothing for 40 minutes, and the men had confessed everything simply to break the silence. That he had walked away from a burning warehouse without looking back, not because he was unaffected, but because he had already calculated the loss and filed it away before the first wall had collapsed. That he had not smiled, genuinely, with his eyes, since a winter evening more than a decade ago that no one in his current circle knew anything about. What his men knew was this: Shin Geometry did not raise his voice, because he never needed to. He did not make threats, because he made decisions. And he did not forgive, not out of cruelty, but out of a deep, structural conviction that forgiveness, in the architecture of power, was simply another word for an unguarded door. He was not a man you approached. You were summoned, or you waited. This was why, when the black SUV had rolled to a stop on the pavement outside the Black Crane that morning and the door had opened, every member of his security detail had already swept the surrounding 50 meters twice. The street was clear. The perimeter was clean. None of them had accounted for a 7-year-old in a pink dress stepping out from the narrow shadow between two parked cars, because none of them had written that particular variable into any threat assessment they had ever been trained to run. She had simply appeared. Small, and soaked, and utterly unafraid of the wrong things. And now Shin stood back inside his building, in the low light of a private corridor, and looked down at the doll still resting in his open palm. The crooked stitching. The single mismatched button eye staring up at him without judgment. His chest was doing something unfamiliar. He didn't have a word for it yet. But it had been a very long time since that had happened, and some dormant, half-buried instinct told him, quietly, the way all important things arrive, that he should pay attention to it. He set the doll on his desk. Not to the side, the way you set down something you intend to discard. He placed it in the center, directly beneath the lamp, the way you place something you need to look at more carefully. Then he sat down, laced his fingers together, and looked at it for a long time without touching it. The doll was roughly the size of a man's forearm. Its body was assembled from at least 4 different fabrics: a square of faded blue linen across the torso, burlap at the legs, a soft gray cotton at the arms. Not mismatched by carelessness. Mismatched by necessity. Someone had used what they had. Every seam was hand-stitched in a tight, careful cross pattern, the thread doubled back on itself at each end with a precision that didn't come from craft classes or YouTube tutorials. It came from a person who had learned, at some point in their life, that if you wanted something to hold, you had to stitch it to last. One eye was a large amber button, slightly scratched. The other was smaller, dark brown, with 4 holes instead of 2. Shin's hand moved before his mind gave the instruction. He picked the doll up and turned it over. Along the lower back, half hidden where the gray cotton met the burlap, there was a small embroidered initial. Not decorative. Practical. The kind of mark a mother puts on a child's belongings so nothing gets lost. S.E. He was still for a long time. Then something shifted behind his eyes, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films. Quietly. The way a locked door sounds when the right key finally finds the mechanism. 11 years ago, Shin Geometry had nearly died in a supply alley off a street that no longer existed under that name. He had been 29. A knife had found the space between his 3rd and 4th rib, and the men who put it there had made the mistake of running rather than finishing what he started. Shin had made it 4 blocks before his legs stopped cooperating. He had gone down against the exterior wall of a small neighborhood clinic, already calculating, with the cold logic that had always been his reflex, how long he had before the math stopped working in his favor. The woman who found him had not screamed. That was the first thing he remembered about her. Most people, confronted with a bleeding man in a dark alley, screamed. She had crouched down, assessed the wound with steady hands, and said only, "Can you walk if I support you?" She had brought him in through the back. She had not asked his name. She had not called the police, though she clearly understood, from the cut of his jacket alone, exactly the kind of man she was stitching back together. She had worked in near silence, her hands calm and sure, and when it was done she had said one thing before quietly leaving the room. Everyone deserves to see morning. He had left before sunrise. He had never gone back. He had told himself it was cleaner that way, for her, more than for him. But he had kept the name of the clinic in some sealed compartment of his memory, the way you keep something you don't trust yourself to examine too often. Sarah Ellis. S.E. The clinic had been registered under that name. He knew, because he had quietly confirmed it afterward, in the manner he confirmed all things, thoroughly and without being seen. He set the doll down again, very carefully. Nova's voice came back to him from the pavement. Mommy said you help people who have nowhere else to go. Sarah Ellis had told her daughter that. Which meant Sarah Ellis had known, all these years, exactly who she had pulled out of that alley. And she had still sent her child to him. He called for Ryu first. Not because Ryu was his most senior lieutenant, he wasn't, but because Ryu was the one man in his organization whose instinct for information had never once been contaminated by personal agenda. He was quiet, methodical, and entirely uninterested in power for its own sake. In a world full of men who wanted to be something, Ryu simply wanted to know things. Shin had always found that useful. Tonight, he found it essential. Ryu arrived in 4 minutes, which meant he had already been in the building. He took one look at the doll on the desk, at the particular quality of stillness Shin was wearing, and he did not ask any unnecessary questions. Sarah Ellis, Shin said. Neighborhood clinic operator. 81 adjacent. Find out when she was taken, how, and by whom. I want sourced information, not inference. You have 1 hour. Ryu left without a word. Shin spent that hour the way he spent all hours of uncertainty, working. He reviewed the week's logistics reports. He signed off on 2 property transfers. He did not look at the doll again, but he was aware of it the entire time, the way you are aware of a sound you cannot place. Ryu returned in 53 minutes. He set a single printed sheet on the desk, face down. That was their arrangement. Ryu delivered. Shin turned it over himself. He read it once, straight through, without expression. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Sarah Ellis had been taken 41 hours ago. Not by a rival syndicate. Not by a street crew operating without sanction. The vehicle used had been registered to a shell company that Shin's own organization used for logistics routing, a company so far inside his financial architecture that even most of his senior men didn't know it existed. The safe house where she was being held had been rented through a broker that reported exclusively to one man. Park Juno. His head of Eastern operations. Shin said nothing for a long time. Ryu remained standing, correctly reading the silence as one that did not require filling. Park Juno had been with the organization for 9 years. He was smart, disciplined, and had always performed. He had also, Shin now understood, been quietly performing a second set of calculations entirely, one that Shin had not been invited into. 3 months ago, Shin had passed Juno over for a seat on the inner council, choosing instead a younger strategist whose thinking was cleaner and whose loyalty had been stress-tested in ways Juno's had not. Shin had considered the matter settled. He had been wrong. Not about the decision, about the reaction. What Juno had built in the months since was becoming clear now, reading between the lines of the logistics report. Small diversions. Redirected funds. Shipments that arrived slightly lighter than they should have. The kind of bleeding that a large organization doesn't notice until it has already lost too much. He had been quietly financing something. An exit, perhaps. Or a takeover. Men like Juno didn't build war chests without a destination in mind. And Sarah Ellis, a civilian, a woman with a small clinic and a daughter who slept with a patchwork doll, had apparently witnessed something she was never supposed to see. A handoff, perhaps. A meeting. Something that made her a loose thread Juno needed to pull before he made his move. He had taken a mother to silence a witness. He had used Shin's own infrastructure to do it. Shin picked up the doll one more time. Turned it over in his hands. Set it back down. Get me the attendance records for last Thursday's shipment rotation, he said quietly. And find out which of my men have been spending above their means. Ryu nodded once. The rot had a name now. The only question that remained was how deep it went. The safe house was on the 4th floor of an unremarkable building in Mapo district, the kind of place that looked, from the outside, like it housed a mid-level accounting firm. Inside, it was clean, secure, and almost entirely without warmth. Reinforced doors. Blackout curtains. A kitchen stocked with practical food rather than good food. It was a place designed for function, not for living in. Nova had been there for 6 hours, and she had already rearranged it. Not physically. She was 7, and the furniture was bolted. But she had done something to the atmosphere that 4 of Shin's most experienced security personnel were struggling to account for. She had, without apparent effort or intention, made the place feel occupied in a way it never had before. She had asked the largest of the 4 men, a former military operative named Beck, who had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and had not smiled in recent professional memory, whether he was hungry. Not whether she was hungry. Whether he was. Beck had stared at her for a long moment and then said, carefully, that he was fine. She had nodded with the grave seriousness of someone filing that information away for later and returned to sitting cross-legged on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, watching the door. She did not cry. That was the thing that unsettled them most. She had cried outside, on the pavement, in the rain, but here, in the safe house, she had made a decision somewhere inside herself and she was holding to it with a discipline that men twice her age rarely managed. She was waiting. She had chosen to believe that waiting would be enough, and she was committed to that belief with everything she had. It was Cho who broke first. Cho was 26, the youngest of the 4, and he had joined the organization at 19 with a set of skills and very few other options. He was not soft. But he had a younger sister somewhere in Busan whom he still sent money to every month without telling anyone, and something about the particular angle of Nova's chin, that quiet, stubborn dignity, got underneath his professional composure in a way he hadn't anticipated. He pulled a worn deck of cards from his jacket pocket. He always carried them. Idle hands, in his line of work, were a liability. "Do you know how to play?" he asked. Nova looked at the cards. Then at him. "Mommy knows go fish. I'll teach you something better." He taught her Siata first, then reconsidered, then settled on a simplified version of a game that existed somewhere between war and a Korean card game his own grandmother had taught him. He made up a rule that the person with the lowest card had to name one thing they were good at. It was a rule his grandmother had never used. He invented it on the spot, and he wasn't entirely sure why. Nova, it turned out, was good at braiding hair, identifying clouds, and remembering the names of every dog she had ever met. Beck sat down at the table at round 4. He didn't say anything. He simply held out his hand for a card, and Cho dealt him in without comment. By round 7, the 4th guard, a stone-faced man named Do who had spoken a combined 11 words since Nova's arrival, had quietly moved his chair 2 feet closer to the table. He didn't play. But he watched. And at some point during round 9, when Nova laid down a winning card and looked up with a smile that was pure and unguarded and entirely unconcerned with the guns these men were carrying, Do reached into his jacket, pulled out a wrapped hard candy, and set it on the table in front of her without a word. Nova took it solemnly, like a dignitary accepting a treaty. "Thank you," she said. Do looked at the wall. But the line of his shoulders had changed. The invitation went out at noon. A dinner. That evening. Shin's private dining room on the 3rd floor of the Black Crane, reserved exclusively for inner circle gatherings. The message was brief and identical for each recipient, 12 senior men in total, including Park Juno. No agenda was listed. No dress code specified beyond the standard that these men already kept. Just a time, a place, and Shin's name at the bottom, which was the only persuasion anyone in his organization ever required. What none of them knew was that the seating arrangement had taken Shin 2 hours to construct. He had placed Juno 4th from his left, close enough to observe clearly, far enough that Juno wouldn't feel the weight of direct scrutiny and adjust his behavior accordingly. The men Ryu's financial review had flagged as potential sympathizers were distributed across both sides of the table, never adjacent to one another, each seated next to someone whose loyalty Shin considered structurally sound. He had also, quietly, ensured that 3 specific topics would surface naturally during the meal. Topics that would mean nothing to an innocent man and everything to one who had been having private conversations he shouldn't have been having. The dinner itself was understated. Good food, served simply. Shin ate, and listened, and spoke just enough to keep the room breathing normally. The first test was the shipment. Midway through the first course, Shin mentioned, casually, as though it were a minor administrative note, that the Eastern logistics route was being suspended for the next 2 weeks due to a customs complication. He watched the table as he said it. 11 men registered mild professional interest or indifference. One man's jaw tightened for approximately half a second before he reached for his glass. The movement was smooth and immediate, a good recovery. But Shin had spent 15 years reading the half-second between a man's thought and his performance of composure, and he did not miss it. The second test was the name. Toward the end of the main course, Shin referenced a fabricated internal witness, a logistics worker he named aloud as someone being considered for relocation, as a precaution. He gave the name clearly, let it sit in the air, and moved on. The name was invented. It did not exist. If it resurfaced anywhere in the next 24 hours, in a phone call, a message, a whispered conversation, Shin would know exactly which direction the leak was flowing. The third test required no engineering. It was simply the bill. At the end of every inner circle dinner, Shin had a long-standing tradition of asking each man at the table to name one thing the organization should do better. It was the kind of question that sounded democratic and was not. It was a mirror. The answers men gave in that room, in that company, with Shin's eyes moving slowly around the table, told him more about the interior architecture of each man's ambitions than any surveillance report ever could. Most answers were careful. Operational. The kind of answers given by men who wanted to appear thoughtful without revealing anything. Juno said the organization needed to invest more heavily in transition planning for leadership continuity. The table moved on. No one reacted. It was, on its surface, a reasonable professional observation. But Shin let it settle into him like a stone into still water, and felt the ripples spread outward and confirm everything Ryu's report had already told him. Leadership continuity. From the men who had taken a civilian woman hostage using Shin's own resources. From the men who had been quietly building a war chest for months. From the men who had, in his own careful language, just told the room what he was planning, and was satisfied, incorrectly, that no one at the table had understood him. After the meal, Shin shook every hand. He thanked every man for their time. He smiled at Juno last. Warm, unhurried, and entirely without mercy. The fabricated name surfaced at 11:14 p.m. Ryu brought the confirmation to Shin without fanfare, a single intercepted message, routed through a burner channel that Juno's people had been using for weeks, asking whether the logistics worker had been dealt with yet. The message had been sent from a device registered to one of Juno's mid-level operators. It had been received by someone at a location Ryu's team had been quietly triangulating for the past 3 hours. A warehouse conversion at the Mapo Marina. 4th floor. River facing. Shin read the confirmation, set it down, and began changing his jacket. He did not bring his full detail. That was deliberate. A large formation moved loudly, announced itself through the simple mathematics of too many bodies occupying too much space. He took 6 men, Ryu, Beck, who had returned from the safe house once Cho and Do had the situation stable, and 4 others whose particular skill sets were suited less to presence and more to precision. Men who understood that the most effective kind of entry was the kind no one heard until it was already finished. They moved in 2 vehicles. No communication beyond what had already been established. Shin rode in silence, watching the Han River through the passenger window as the city's reflection fractured and reassembled across the dark water. He was not thinking about Juno. He was thinking about a woman who had crouched in a back alley doorway 11 years ago and asked a bleeding stranger if he could walk. The marina complex had 4 access points. Ryu had mapped all of them within the hour using building registry documents and a contact inside the district planning office. The primary entrance was staffed, 2 men, professionally positioned, the kind of posture that came from training rather than instinct. The eastern stairwell was unwatched, accessible through a maintenance corridor that ran beneath the building's loading infrastructure. They went in through the east. Shin moved with his team the way water moves through a system, finding the path of least resistance not out of passivity, but out of efficiency. The maintenance corridor was dark and smelled of diesel and river damp. He registered these things and filed them away without letting them slow him. At the base of the eastern stairwell, Ryu held up 2 fingers, then pointed up. 2 more men on the landing above. Shin nodded. Beck and 1 other peeled away without a sound. 20 seconds later, Ryu lowered his hand. They climbed. The 4th floor opened into a converted loft space, exposed beams, industrial lighting currently dimmed to its lowest setting, and a floor plan that Ryu had estimated correctly to within 4 meters. There were 3 rooms partitioned by temporary walls toward the river-facing end. The first was empty. The second contained equipment, communications hardware, a folding table with printed documents that Shin noted but did not stop for. The third room had a light on beneath the door. He opened it himself. Sarah Ellis was seated in a chair, wrists bound with zip ties to the armrests, her head down. She was conscious. Her clinic uniform, she had apparently been taken directly from work, was rumpled but intact. There was a bruise along her left jaw that Shin's eyes moved to and did not move away from for a moment. She looked up when the door opened. Her expression cycled through fear, confusion, and then something that landed in a place between relief and disbelief. She knew his face. Of course she did. She had been the one holding the needle. "Nova," she said immediately. "Not help me. Not thank you. Nova." "She's safe," Shin said. "She's been safe since this morning." Sarah Ellis closed her eyes. The breath that left her body had been held, it seemed, for 41 hours. Shin crouched down and began working the zip ties loose himself, and neither of them said another word, because some debts, and some moments, exist cleanly on the other side of language. The shipment was worth $11 million. Shin knew this because he had negotiated the terms himself, 4 months ago, in a room in Busan with 3 men who did not tolerate renegotiation. The cargo was already in transit. The window for interception and rerouting was exactly 90 minutes long, beginning at 1 a.m., after which it would pass beyond the reach of anyone in his organization and into the hands of the receiving party. Missing that window did not simply mean a delayed transaction. It meant a permanent severance with a network that had taken 6 years to build. His phone showed 12:41 a.m. when they brought Sarah Ellis down through the eastern stairwell. He did the arithmetic without being asked. He always did. Ryu appeared at his shoulder as they reached the ground floor corridor. He said nothing. But he held his phone at a slight angle, screen facing Shin, the logistics coordinator's message, timestamped 12 minutes ago, confirming the shipment was on schedule and awaiting final authorization. One message. One confirmation. Shin could send it in 4 seconds. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked at Sarah Ellis, standing in the corridor with her wrists marked from the zip ties, her hand pressed flat against the wall for balance, her first question upon being freed still ringing in the space between them. Not "where are we going?" Not "what happens now?" Just Nova's name, twice, until he had answered her. He handed the phone back to Ryu without sending anything. Ryu pocketed it. If he had an opinion about $11 million walking away into the dark, he kept it in the same place he kept everything else, somewhere inaccessible and professionally silent. They found Juno on the 2nd floor. Not by accident. Ryu's triangulation had placed him in the building for the last 2 hours, overseeing, apparently, from a comfortable distance. He was in a side office off the main corridor, seated at a desk with a glass of whiskey and the particular composure of a man who had not yet been told that his plan had stopped working. 2 of his own men stood behind him. They assessed the situation when Shin walked in and made the correct calculation immediately, stepping back and away from anything that could be interpreted as a defensive posture. Juno was slower to recalibrate. He stood. Straightened his jacket. And for a moment, Shin watched him decide which version of this conversation to attempt, the one where there was still a negotiation to be had, or the one where there wasn't. It was, Shin reflected, a decision Juno had already made for himself months ago, the first time he diverted funds that weren't his and told himself it was the beginning of something rather than the end. "The shipment," Juno began. "Is gone," Shin said. "Walk me through the rest." It wasn't a question. It was an accounting, the same cold, column-by-column reckoning that Shin applied to every ledger. Juno had expected leverage. He had built the entire structure of his rebellion on the assumption that Shin, faced with the choice between $11 million and a civilian woman, would do what men in their world always did. He would calculate. He would rationalize. He would choose the money and call it pragmatism. He had misread the ledger entirely. Because Shin geometry had, in the last 18 hours, held a child's entire world in one hand and felt something in his chest come back online that he had believed was permanently dark. And a man who has just remembered what he is capable of protecting does not then make the choice that proves he never learned anything at all. Juno sat back down. Slowly. The glass of whiskey remained untouched beside him. Outside in the corridor, Sarah Ellis was on her feet, steady now, walking toward the exit under her own strength. Shin watched her go, then turned back to the room. 9 years, he said quietly to Juno. And you still didn't understand what I was building. He left the rest to Ryu. They drove in silence, the two vehicles moving through the city's late-night quiet with the kind of unhurried steadiness that belongs to people who have already resolved the most dangerous part of the evening. Sarah Ellis sat in the rear of the first vehicle, a jacket that wasn't hers draped across her shoulders. Beck had produced it without comment, the way he seemed to produce everything, from a place beyond explanation. She was looking out the window at the passing city, and Shin, seated across from her, did not interrupt whatever she was working through. He understood the particular quality of that silence. It was the silence of a person recalculating everything, what had happened, what could have happened, and the very narrow distance between the two. She had asked only one practical question during the drive. Whether Nova had eaten. Shin had thought about it for a moment, and then told her about the cards. He kept it brief, the table, the men, the hard candy that Do had produced with such studied indifference. He wasn't sure why he told her. Perhaps because it was the truest answer to what she was actually asking, which was not about food at all. Sarah had turned back to the window. But something in the line of her shoulders changed, and she pressed 2 fingers briefly against her mouth, and Shin looked away and gave her that in private. The safe house building came into view at 2:17 a.m. Cho met them in the ground floor corridor, and the single look he exchanged with Beck contained an entire debrief's worth of information compressed into half a second. Everything was fine. She was upstairs. She had fallen asleep at the card table 40 minutes ago and they had moved her to the couch, and no one had said anything about it, but no one had moved very far from the room either. They took the stairs. Shin held the stairwell door open. Sarah went through first, and he followed at a distance, close enough to be present, far enough to understand that what was about to happen did not belong to him. The safe house door was already open. Cho had gone ahead. When Sarah stepped through the threshold and into the low-lit room, she stopped. Nova was on the couch, asleep on her side, both hands tucked beneath her cheek in the way that children sleep, completely, without reservation, as if the world is a safe enough place to be entirely unguarded in. Someone had folded Do's jacket into a rough pillow beneath her head. The card game was still spread across the table nearby, mid-round, abandoned with the careful preservation of something that someone intended to return to. Sarah Ellis crossed the room in 5 steps. She didn't wake Nova immediately. She knelt on the floor beside the couch and stayed there for a moment, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's hair, and the sound she made was not loud, it was the quietest kind of crying, the kind that comes after the fear has finally been given permission to leave the body. Shin's men, every single one of them, found something to look at that was not Sarah Ellis on the floor beside her daughter. Beck studied the window latch with deep professional interest. Cho discovered a pressing need to review the card table. Do, who had not meaningfully altered his facial expression in 4 years of active service, turned to face the wall entirely and stayed there. Nova woke slowly, the way children wake, blinking, confused, already reaching before she was fully conscious of what she was reaching for. And then her hands found her mother's face, and she said "Mommy" in a voice so small and so complete that the word seemed to contain the entire weight of the 41 hours that had just ended. Shin stepped back into the corridor and closed the door quietly behind him. He stood alone for a moment in the narrow hallway, the sounds of reunion muffled behind the door, and he looked down at his hands, the same hands that had freed zip ties, redirected shipments, and built an empire on controlled, deliberate force. They were, he noticed, not entirely steady. He let them be. He came back in the morning. Not early, he waited until the city had properly woken, until the light coming through the safehouse windows was the kind that belonged to ordinary days rather than the tail end of extraordinary nights. He arrived without his detail. Just Ryu, who waited downstairs in the car with the particular patience of a man who had long since stopped finding Shin's decisions surprising. He knocked. Cho opened the door, read the situation correctly, and stepped aside. Sarah was at the small kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, dressed in clothes that Shin's people had sourced overnight, practical, her size, unremarkable. She looked rested in the way that people look rested when they have slept from pure emotional exhaustion rather than peace. The bruise along her jaw had deepened overnight to a dark purple, and Shin's eyes moved to it once before he sat down across from her. Nova was still asleep in the next room. He could hear the soft, even rhythm of it through the half-open door. Neither he nor Sarah spoke immediately. They were, he reflected, people who had now twice shared a significant silence, the first in a back-alley clinic, the second in a marina corridor, and had arrived, somehow, at a third. It felt less uncomfortable than it should have. Perhaps because silences between people who have already seen each other clearly require less management than silences between people who are still performing for one another. You didn't have to come back, Sarah said finally. Not as an accusation. As an observation. I'm returning something, Shin said. He set the doll on the table between them. Sarah looked at it for a moment, then back at him, and he could see her understanding, that it had been examined, that it had been recognized, that the initial SE stitched into the lower back had done exactly what it was always going to do once the right person held it long enough. She saved for 3 months for those buttons, Sarah said quietly. She wanted Luna to have eyes that didn't match because she said it made her more interesting. Shin said nothing. He reached over and turned the doll gently onto its side. The small pocket, decorative, barely functional, sewn into the seam of the doll's left hip, had a slight weight to it now that it hadn't had before. Sarah reached in carefully and withdrew a card. Matte black. No logo, no name, no number. Just a single silver character embossed in the center, a stylized symbol that meant nothing to the general public and everything to the people who needed it to mean something. She looked at it for a long time. What is this? She asked, though her voice suggested she understood more than the question implied. It means Nova's education is funded. Medical, for both of you, indefinitely. If anyone ever gives you a problem you cannot resolve through ordinary means, he paused, choosing the words with the care he applied to everything, you present that card to whoever is making your life difficult, and the problem will stop. Sarah set the card down on the table. She looked at it, then at the doll, then at him. I pulled you out of an alley, she said. I put in some stitches. I gave you a glass of water. You told me everyone deserves to see morning, Shin said. And then you sent your daughter to find me, which means you believed it still applied to you. He stood, straightening his jacket. You were right. A sound came from the next room, small, rustling, the particular sequence of noises that precede a child fully waking up. Then Nova's voice, still soft with sleep, Mommy. Sarah stood immediately, the card and the doll both gathered to her chest. She paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at him. Thank you, she said. Simply. Without architecture or qualification. Shin nodded once. Then he walked to the front door, let himself out quietly, and went back down the stairs into the ordinary morning, which was, he was finding, not quite as ordinary as it had once seemed. 3 months later, Shin Geometry began taking a different route home. It wasn't efficiency that changed his path. The new route was actually 4 minutes longer, navigated a less convenient stretch of road, and required his driver to adjust the evening schedule by a margin that Ryu had noted once and never mentioned again. It took the car through a quieter residential pocket of the city, the kind of neighborhood that didn't appear in any of Shin's operational maps because nothing valuable, by his former accounting, existed there. Except that a small clinic sat on the corner of that street. And a girl in a pink dress sometimes played on the front steps after school, with a patchwork doll that had mismatched eyes, watched over by a woman who looked up sometimes when the black car passed and did not look away afraid. He never stopped. He didn't need to. This is the part of the story that doesn't get told often enough, not the rescue, not the confrontation, not the moment the guns were drawn or the zip ties were cut or the $11 million dissolved into the dark. Those things are dramatic. They are easy to remember. But they are not where the actual weight of the story lives. The weight lives here. In a 4-minute detour. In the discipline of a man who chose, quietly and without audience, to become something slightly different from what he had been. Consider what it actually cost Shin Geometry to do what he did. Not the shipment, though $11 million is not an abstraction, and anyone who tells you money doesn't matter has never built something from nothing and watched it walk away. Not the political fallout of dismantling Juno's network, which created instability that took weeks to resolve. Not the whispers that moved through the syndicate afterward, the quiet recalibration of how his men understood him, the subtle shift in the architecture of fear that had always been his primary structural material. What it cost him was the story he had told himself for 30 years. The story that said he was beyond the reach of ordinary obligation. That the social contract, The invisible agreement between people that says I will not harm you, and in return you will not harm me, and together we will hold the world in some workable shape, did not apply to men who operated outside its boundaries. He had built his entire identity on the premise that he had opted out. That the rules governing conscience and reciprocity and the protection of the vulnerable were constructs for people who needed them, and he did not. A 7-year-old girl with a patchwork doll had walked through that premise and dismantled it in under 2 minutes. Not through argument. Not through moral pressure or appeal to principle. Simply by believing, with complete and undefended certainty, that he was the right person to help her. That the man the world called a monster was, in some essential way that she could not have articulated but felt entirely, still accountable to something. She was right. That is the thing that mattered. She was right, and he knew it, and the knowing changed him. Here is what the story of Shin Geometry and Nova Ellis is actually teaching, beneath the rain-slick pavement and the loyalty tests and the marina at midnight. It is teaching that power without conscience is simply destruction on a schedule. That integrity costs something real, and that the cost is precisely what makes it mean anything. That one act of genuine kindness, offered without calculation or expectation of return, does not disappear into the past. It moves forward through time like a current beneath still water, invisible and patient, until the moment it is needed. Sarah Ellis had stitched a bleeding man back together in the dark and asked nothing for it. 11 years later, that single act came back and carried her daughter home. No kindness is wasted. Not one. Even the ones that feel, in the moment of giving, like they cost you everything you have.